They didn't bury their dead. They displayed them. Beneath the blistering sun of 19th-century Mexico, an unspeakable punishment was born, not from superstition, but from bureaucracy. In the high-altitude mining town of Guanajuato, where the ground was too rocky for proper graves and coffins were a luxury, something horrific began to take root. It started with the poor. Then it spread to the outcasts, the criminals, the unwanted. If you couldn't pay the burial tax, the city came for your body. But it wasn't just exhumation. What they found in the crypts was something far worse. Some corpses still had hair, eyelashes, agonized mouths, open in mid-scream. Some had hands pressed against their faces, frozen not in peace, but in terror. Because the truth slowly emerged. Some of these people may not have been dead when they were buried. And Guanajuato didn't hide this. They displayed it, turning their dead into a museum of mummified shame. But the real horror? The city didn't just document death. It created it. And it's still happening today. Welcome to the city that mummified its criminals alive. This is a story of poverty, punishment, and a legacy of horror that refuses to rot. Now we begin. It didn't begin with a murder. It began with a receipt. In the late 1800s, the colonial town of Guanajuato, nestled high in the arid mountains of central Mexico, was experiencing a problem that seemed, on paper, quite mundane. The cemeteries were full. The city had limited space, and the rocky soil made deep graves expensive and hard to dig. Bodies took longer to decompose in the dry, mineral-rich air. And unlike the grand, flower-drenched Catholic burials for the rich, the poor were simply placed in crypts, stacked one above the other like forgotten books in a dusty library. But even the dead couldn't escape bureaucracy. In 1865, a local ordinance was passed. If a family couldn't afford to keep paying the burial tax, essentially, rent for a corpse, the city had the right to evict the body. You had 5 years. After that, the grave was no longer yours. No payment, no peace. At first, it was treated like policy. Quiet, cold, civil. Officials opened the crypts of the unpaid, moved the remains into a charnel house, and prepared the space for reuse. But something strange began happening as workers opened more graves. The corpses weren't skeletons. They weren't even decomposed. They were dry, whole, preserved. And worse, they looked alive. The first man they pulled out was fully dressed. His skin, leathery and gray, was still wrapped around his bones. His eyes had sunken, but the sockets weren't empty. He had teeth, eyelashes. His mouth was twisted in something between pain and surprise. No embalming. No chemicals. Just death, dry air, and maybe something else. City officials were stunned. Locals whispered the word, mummy. But this wasn't ancient Egypt. This wasn't ceremonial. These were people. Poor people. Working-class men and women, even children, left to rot in municipal crypts, only to be exhumed and displayed like curiosities. It should have ended there. Instead, it began a morbid fascination that the city quickly realized could be monetized. By the 1900s, the city opened a small building next to the cemetery. For a few centavos, curious visitors could come see Las Momias de Guanajuato, the mummies of Guanajuato. At first, it was treated like a freak show. But as word spread, tourism grew. More bodies were exhumed. More unpaid crypts were opened. And the corpses? They kept coming out intact. Some were believed to be miners who had inhaled toxic gases, preserving them from the inside out. Others were thought to have died of cholera, quickly buried in sealed crypts to prevent contagion, which ironically aided their preservation. Some were believed to have been buried in sealed wooden coffins that prevented decomposition. But behind the scientific theories lurked something darker. Because as the museum filled up, so did the rumors. People weren't just horrified by the bodies. They were haunted by the expressions, the open mouths, the clawed fingers, the agony. Historians tried to explain it away: shrinkage of skin, tightening of muscle fibers, post-mortem tension. But others weren't so sure. A pattern was emerging. Some of the mummies had been buried too soon, and some may not have been dead at all. But the city didn't stop. They couldn't. The tax was law, and the bodies kept coming. Guanajuato wasn't just any Mexican town. It was a jewel of colonial Spain, famed for its labyrinthine alleyways, colorful hillside houses, and the veins of silver that pulsed beneath its soil. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the silver mines made the city rich, But not everyone shared in the wealth. For every wealthy merchant who built a mansion with arched balconies and gold-leaf ceilings, there were hundreds of men toiling in the shafts, inhaling dust, suffocating in silence, and dying young. If not from cave-ins, then from invisible poisons buried in the rock. Arsenic, mercury, lead. These elements seeped into lungs, skin, and bone. And unknowingly, they may have turned the dead into mummies. The miners were the first to show up in the crypts. Unclaimed, unpaid, poor. Their families were often transient or gone, sometimes unaware of the burial tax. When the 5-year mark hit, city workers came with keys, crowbars, and ledgers. They unlocked the iron doors. They slid out the coffins. And what emerged was no longer a person, but a relic. Rigid, brown, and horrifyingly intact. But the city wasn't burying them again. They were putting them on display. Some of these miners were displayed with their arms twisted across their chests. Others had faces frozen in what looked like screams. More than one had the unmistakable grimace of someone who had choked on gas before death, or something worse. Some mummies showed bite marks on their own arms. Others were found with broken fingers, as though they'd clawed at their coffins. One body, nicknamed El Ahogado, the drowned man, was so perfectly preserved, it looked like he'd just stepped out of a nightmare. Eyebrows, mustache, even the lines of pain etched into his cheeks remained. And then came the insane. There was no hospital for the mentally ill in 19th century Guanajuato. The mad, the deformed, and the epileptic were often cast out, jailed, or abandoned. If they died unclaimed, they were buried like everyone else. Cheaply, quickly, and often still twitching. One mummy, known only as La Bruja, the witch, was a woman with contorted limbs and sunken cheeks, arms bent backwards unnaturally, eyes wide open. Locals believed she was possessed. A few whispered that she cursed those who stared too long. Her face, even now, seems locked in mid-moan, as though she never stopped screaming. And then came the children. This was where the museum began to lose its soul entirely. Tiny coffins were removed. Infant remains, mummified by the same dry climate, were stood up, dressed in doll-like clothes, and placed in glass cases. Tourists came. Some wept. Others laughed nervously. But the city kept collecting. They began tagging the bodies with names. Nicknames. Causes of death, real or imagined. El Griton, the Screamer, La Bella Durmiente, Sleeping Beauty, Niño Despertado. The woken child, each one frozen in the last moment of their miserable life. Each one taken not just from death, but from dignity. The mummies were no longer victims of poverty. They were property, a spectacle, lined up in rows like a parade of shame. And still, no one stopped to ask the obvious question. Why were so many of them so perfectly preserved? And why did some of them look like they died trying to get out? The answer would come, slowly, painfully, and far too late. It wasn't supposed to be terrifying. In 1865, when cemetery workers opened the first unpaid crypts, they expected bones. Maybe rags. Dust. What they found instead, staring back at them through crumbling coffins, was flesh. Dry, leathery flesh. Skin stretched tight over cheekbones, lips shrunken but still intact. Ears. Hair. Even fingernails. It was as if death had paused. As if something had interrupted the rot. One worker reportedly ran screaming after prying open a coffin and locking eyes with a man who still looked awake. Word spread fast, not just among the clergy and local officials, but through the streets, into taverns. Whispers carried on the breath of the curious and the fearful. This wasn't decay. It was preservation, and no one could explain why. They cracked open the next crypt. Same thing, and the next, and the next. A pattern emerged. Most of the bodies were buried in sealed crypts, stone chambers stacked in rows along the cemetery walls. The arid climate inside, devoid of moisture and oxygen, acted like a natural kiln. Bodies didn't rot, they cured. But there was something else. Something chilling. Some corpses looked like they died fighting. One man was found with his arms crossed in a death grip across his face, as if shielding himself from something. A woman was discovered clutching a cloth rag in her mouth, chewed nearly to threads. One had fractured nails and scraped knuckles, consistent with clawing at a wooden lid. In the old burial records, there were gaps. Cases labeled cholera, unknown, or sudden death. But cholera outbreaks had a grim feature. Bodies were often buried hastily to avoid contagion. No embalming. No verification. If you weren't moving, you were pronounced dead, sometimes within hours. In other words, people were buried in a hurry, and some may have still been alive. The Museum of the Mummies didn't begin with a vision. It began with a pile. Initially, the mummified bodies were stored in a backroom, propped up against each other like firewood. Gravediggers brought their friends in after hours to see the freaks. One brought a journalist, then a photographer, then a schoolteacher. By 1904, the city realized what they had: a macabre gold mine. A room was cleared, lights were installed, and the bodies were arranged like an art exhibit. Locals came first, then curious travelers, then foreign tourists, hungry for horror. One of the first official visitors was none other than the famed Mexican writer Luis González Obregón. He called the mummies a window into the last breath of the forgotten. But even he admitted something was wrong. The mouths. They weren't serene. They were contorted, as if frozen in the very moment of pain. Eyelids pulled back, lips drawn tight. Some had jaws wide open, teeth bared, like they had died mid-scream. Medical experts were called in. Some attributed the expressions to cadaveric spasm, a rare form of muscle stiffening that occurs at the moment of death, preserving the facial expression. Others weren't convinced. The mummy's condition didn't align with textbook examples. And besides, cadaveric spasm couldn't explain the broken nails, the scratched coffin lids, the bitten tongues. Over time, more and more bodies were brought in. At first, only those whose families hadn't paid the tax. Later, bodies were exhumed for their quality. The best preserved, those that looked the most grotesque, were put on display. The rest? Forgotten again. One local priest reportedly protested, calling it blasphemous desecration. But he was ignored. Tourism was booming, and the city didn't care how the dead had died. They only cared that people would pay to look at them. By the 1930s, the exhibit had become a rite of passage for morbid thrill seekers. Children posed beside corpses. Couples took photos next to infant mummies. Local guides told ghost stories and urban legends. But beneath the spectacle, the horror was real. Some of those people weren't supposed to be in the museum. They were supposed to be in their graves. Alive. Most people think of mummies as ancient. Dried husks, hollowed eye sockets, skin flaking like paper. Lifeless. But not these. In Guanajuato, some of the mummies still had their eyes. One, nicknamed La Mujer Triste, the sad woman, was a mother found with both eyelids intact, lashes clinging to the upper ridges like she had just blinked. Behind those lids, the shrunken, glassy remains of her eyeballs. Dried, yes, but present. And staring. Visitors swore the eyes followed them as they moved. Another body, an old man dubbed El Vigilante, or the Watchman, was found with one lid half open. Beneath it, a hazy, clouded iris. Some called it an illusion. Others were convinced it was proof. This man had seen his own death coming. But there was one mummy that shook even the hardened curators. Ignacia Aguilar. She died in the early 1900s. Or so they said. Ignacia was believed to have suffered from a condition that mimicked death, a state of deep catatonia, with barely detectable vital signs. Her family, seeing her unresponsive, had her quickly buried during a wave of cholera-related panic. The burial was rushed. No doctor signed off. No time for last rites. 5 years later, when the city opened her crypt, they found something that horrified even the most experienced workers. Her body was curled in the fetal position. Her face was contorted in terror, her hands clenched into fists, the fingernails broken and bloodied. The inside of her coffin lid bore deep scratches, etched into the wood with human desperation. She hadn't died of cholera. She had died of suffocation. Alive, buried, awake. Her body was so well preserved, it became the centerpiece of the exhibit. Children screamed when they saw her. Parents gasped and turned away. Her mouth was open, frozen in what could only be described as a final, silent scream. A moment of realization turned eternal. Even today, some guides refuse to stand near her for too long. They say her expression changes, minute by minute, year by year. And then there was the infant with eyes. This was perhaps the most disturbing mummy in the entire collection. It was a baby, no more than a year old, preserved so perfectly that not only the eyes, but the tiny eyelashes, the fine hairs on its head, and even the folds of its skin remained intact. It wasn't displayed like the others, in open air, but in a glass case. People begged the museum to remove it. They said it was too much, too real, too cruel. But it stayed, because horror sells. And in Guanajuato, the line between spectacle and suffering had already been erased. By mid-century, the museum was an international sensation. Guidebooks called it a must-see. Travel magazines listed it alongside architectural landmarks. But the truth behind the glass, the real truth, was ignored. That some of these people had likely been entombed prematurely. That science alone couldn't explain it all. That what you were seeing wasn't just death preserved. It was trauma, frozen. And those eyes? They weren't just for show. They were witnesses. They saw what the living didn't want to admit. That death, here, had a clock. And if you were poor enough, forgotten enough, or unlucky enough, you didn't get to choose when yours arrived. Someone else did. You can only ignore the evidence for so long. The screams carved into wood, the fractured nails, the twisted bodies. One or two might be coincidence. But dozens? By the 1950s, as the museum swelled with visitors and revenue, a few medical professionals and historians began to ask questions the city didn't want to answer. Chief among them, how many of these people were buried alive? The answer, disturbingly, was possibly more than we'll ever know. Mexico in the 19th and early 20th centuries was no stranger to premature burials. Across the country, outbreaks of cholera, yellow fever, and typhus had pushed communities into panic. The dead were buried quickly, sometimes within hours of apparent death, to avoid the spread of disease. With no modern diagnostic tools, a motionless body, especially one in a coma or cataleptic state, could easily be declared dead. There are records, dozens, of people waking up during their own funerals, clawing out of shallow graves, screaming from inside crypts. The horror wasn't a myth. It was documented. And Guanajuato, dry as it was, only preserved what most cities buried deeper. Take Jose Luis Ramirez, a field worker who was found decades later with his legs contorted beneath him, head wedged sideways against the coffin wall. His knuckles were shattered, his mouth stuffed with the lining of his own shirt. His autopsy, done nearly 60 years after his death, showed no internal signs of disease. He hadn't died of illness. He had died of oxygen starvation. Another body, referred to only as the coffin drummer, was found in a casket with fist-sized dents in the interior wood. His fingernails were embedded in splinters. And his face? A mask of terror. Lips peeled back. Eyes wide open. Not from decay, but from fear. And yet, the city pressed on. Tour guides dismissed the buried alive theory as folklore. Museum officials parroted medical explanations: cadaveric spasm, post-mortem shrinkage, dehydration effects. Neat, scientific labels for something unspeakable. But visitors weren't convinced. Especially when they saw the baby. The child who bit his tongue, a toddler mummy, displayed in the far corridor of the museum, became infamous not just for its intact skin and clothing, but for the trail of blood found inside its mouth. Dried, preserved, his tongue bore deep bite marks. The theory: he woke up, alone, in the dark, and bit down to scream. To this day, no official investigation has ever been launched into how many Guanajuato mummies were buried alive. No committee, no forensic audit. The museum deflects, pointing to historical burial practices and environmental conditions. But the signs are there, in every twisted limb, every stretched mouth, every scarred hand. And the tragedy doesn't stop with the dead. It continues in the silence of the living. Because for decades, families were never told that their loved ones had been dug up. They returned years later with flowers and prayers, only to find the crypt empty. When they asked, they were told the truth only if they pushed. Many were devastated to learn their mother, brother, or child had become a tourist attraction, without consent, without dignity, without closure. Some even discovered their relatives featured on postcards. Yes, real postcards. In the 1970s, mummies from Guanajuato were featured on souvenirs sold in nearby shops. Faces frozen in fear, packaged for fun. Tourists bought them, sent them across the world. Wish you were here, they joked. No one saw the irony. Back in the crypts, the display grew. New lighting, new corridors, even gift shops. And the bodies kept coming. Until one day, a quiet voice finally said, "Enough." But it didn't come from the government. Or the museum? Or the church? It came from one of the mummies themselves. At least, that's what the rumors say. It started with a whisper. A tour guide at the Museo de las Momias claimed he heard it one night, long after the last visitor had left. A faint sound, like fabric rustling, or breath catching in a dry throat. He turned, flashlight sweeping through the corridor of corpses. And there she was, Ignacia Aguilar, mouth wide, hands frozen mid-clench. Only this time, her head was tilted differently. Of course, the museum dismissed it, blamed it on shadows, vivid imagination, fatigue. But the staff knew better. More than one had heard the whispers, felt cold air in sealed rooms, swore the expressions changed. But nothing, not ghosts, not rumors, not guilt, could stop what came next. The mummies went on tour. In the late 1970s, Guanajuato saw its mummies not just as artifacts, but as a brand. The most grotesque corpses, Ignacia, the screamer, the baby with eyes, were carefully packaged, sealed in mobile display cases, and sent across Mexico. The traveling mummy exhibition. Tickets sold out in every city. Families lined up for hours. Children posed for photos, ice cream in one hand, horror in the other. And then, in 2004, they came to the United States. Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston. Major cities welcomed them like celebrities. News outlets marveled at the natural preservation. Viewers gawked at the twisted bodies on television. Some museums refused to host them. Others doubled down, selling branded merchandise, keychains, t-shirts, replica figurines. What had started as tragedy was now entertainment. But there were cracks in the coffin. Ethicists began to speak out. Historians questioned the legality. Religious leaders protested. One Catholic bishop in Mexico called the exhibit a circus of the damned, accusing the government of violating sacred human dignity. The museum countered with science. It's history, they said. It's anthropology. They didn't talk about the scratched coffin lids, or the eyes, or the families who never gave consent. Instead, they leaned in further, expanded the gift shop, added a horror-themed ride near the cemetery, installed mannequins dressed like the mummies for photo ops. School field trips were organized. Children were taken to learn from the dead. But what were they learning? That if you were poor, your body could be owned. That even in death, the system still demanded payment. And that your final scream might not be buried, it might be framed. Over time, some of the mummies began to deteriorate. The dry air of Guanajuato had preserved them, but foreign climates did not. Faces began to cave. Skin flaked. One mummy reportedly lost a hand during transit. But the museum never stopped. Because the dead don't sue. In 2007, a lawsuit was filed by the living. A woman named Teresa Calderon claimed her grandfather, mummified and displayed in the museum, had never been given proper burial. She demanded his removal. The court denied her. Why? Because he had no burial rights. The crypt tax had lapsed, and the body had become state property. That single word, property, summed up everything. These weren't victims. Not to the city. Not anymore. They were inventory. And if the most disturbing theory was true, some of them may have still been conscious when their transformation began. But worse than death by suffocation was the next horror on the list, death by reputation. Because soon, the museum would begin labeling the dead. Not by name, but by crime. And what they revealed was darker than anyone imagined. Not all the mummies in Guanajuato were innocent. At least, that's what the museum wanted people to believe. In the 1980s, a quiet change began to take place in the dark corridors of the exhibit. New placards were printed. Old names were replaced. And beneath certain corpses, a new title appeared. Delinquent. Criminal. One mummy, a wiry man with shriveled lips pulled back in a grimace, was relabeled Ladrón Ejecutado, executed thief. His records were spotty at best. Rumors claimed he'd been hung for robbery. Others said he was simply imprisoned during the Porfiriato regime and died in a cell. Either way, his punishment wasn't enough. His body had been turned into a warning, a monument to fear. Another was simply labeled, El Violator. No trial records. No date of death. Just a word. And a corpse. The museum had shifted from a macabre curiosity into something darker, a theater of moral judgment. Visitors were no longer just looking at the dead, they were condemning them. But who decided who was guilty? Who deserved to rot in eternal exposure? No court records were made public. No autopsies. No names verified. Only labels. And stories. And worse, children were not spared. Several infant and toddler mummies began appearing with bizarre backstories. One, labeled Niño del Demonio, the demon's child, was said to be the offspring of a witch. The tale was pure invention, whispered by local guides looking for shock value. But the label stuck. Another child was known simply as La Maldita, the cursed girl. She had died of a fever. That's all. But her preserved body, lying with arms at her sides and mouth slightly open, became the center of ghost stories. Visitors claimed she blinked. Others said her body moved slightly each night. Cameras malfunctioned near her display. Paranormal investigators flocked in. Tourists crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The museum capitalized on it. Her case was redesigned. Her legend printed on pamphlets. She became more than dead. She became entertainment. But behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Employees quit. One former caretaker, speaking anonymously, claimed the staff was under pressure not to report signs of decomposition or damage. When one mummy collapsed during a private tour, it was quietly removed, replaced with a mannequin, and never spoken of again. And then came the curses. For decades, locals had whispered that certain mummies carried mal de ojo, the evil eye. Tourists who mocked or touched the displays reported sudden illnesses. Car crashes. Miscarriages. One story involved a woman who spit at one of the criminal mummies during a dare. That night, she reportedly went blind in one eye. Of course, rational minds chalked it up to coincidence. Superstition. Suggestion. But those who worked inside the crypt for years told a different story. They said the air changed near some of the bodies. They said shadows moved where they shouldn't. They said names whispered back. But curses weren't the only horrors lingering. In 2015, a leaked internal memo from the municipal government suggested a new project, expanding the museum with a psychological horror section, including sound effects, lighting, and interactive displays. Turn the trauma of the dead into an amusement ride. Public backlash stopped it. Barely. But the damage was done. The truth had been exposed. Guanajuato no longer preserved its mummies for science or mourning. It preserved them for commerce. Criminals. Children. The cursed and the unnamed. Their last moments stolen. Their legacy written by strangers. Their corpses passed like merchandise through the hands of countless gawkers. Each one snapping photos, laughing nervously, or shivering with dread. But not all the horror was in the past. Because even today, new mummies are still being made. And the most disturbing part? They're not from history. They're from right now. Science is supposed to explain everything. It's supposed to lift the veil, separate truth from myth, and offer clarity where fear once lived. But in Guanajuato, science has been oddly silent. For decades, the official line has been that the mummies are naturally preserved. The arid climate, the sealed crypts, the mineral content of the soil. Together, they create what's known as natural mummification, a rare but documented phenomenon. But here's the problem. Guanajuato is not unique. And yet no other cemetery in the region has produced mummies like these, at this scale, with this level of preservation. Why? In the 1990s, a team of Mexican and international researchers was granted limited access to study the mummies up close. What they found contradicted almost every public narrative. Tissue samples showed unusual concentrations of heavy metals, particularly arsenic and mercury, well beyond environmental exposure. Bone cores from several mummies showed signs of exposure to toxic gases in the days or hours leading up to death, likely inhaled during mining or illness, or during panic-stricken burials where they were still breathing. One mummy showed lung expansion consistent with asphyxiation, a detail that can only be caught in cases of conscious, agonal breathing. But the most damning discovery? Fibers from within the mummies' mouths. Bits of linen, cotton, even burlap, material that had been bitten, not swallowed. This wasn't just death. It was suffering, preserved. Yet almost none of this made it to the public. The final report was buried in government archives. A watered-down summary was released to journalists, boiled down to dry phrases like unique atmospheric conditions and post-mortem contraction of muscle tissue. But that's not all that was hidden. In 2009, another report quietly surfaced from a different source, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH. They had concerns, serious ones, not about the cause of death, but the conditions of storage. Most of the mummies were being displayed in open-air glass boxes, with no climate control. Visitors could come within inches. Some even touched the bodies. And tests showed that fungal spores and bacteria were growing inside some of the display cases. Several of the mummies had already begun to degrade from living visitors. The irony was sickening. These people had survived decay for over a century, but they were now being killed again by the very hands that came to gawk at them. INA issued a warning. The mummies were biohazards, a public health risk, but the museum pushed back hard. They claimed the bodies were sealed, that the threats were exaggerated. After all, fear attracts tourists just as much as wonder. Yet behind the scenes, quiet changes were made. Some mummies were removed and placed in sealed, climate-controlled coffins. Others were quietly retired, taken off display without explanation. The museum began to limit photography. No more flash, no more direct contact. But the real horror? New bodies were being added. That's right. Even into the 21st century, the crypt tax still existed. And when families failed to pay it, the city still had the legal right to dig up the dead. Visitors in the early 2000s began noticing strange things. New faces, modern clothing, shoes with rubber soles, bodies with dental work. One even had a wristwatch. These weren't 19th century peasants. They were people who had died in the 1970s, 1980s, even the 1990s. And they were mummifying just like the old ones. But now, they weren't just being preserved. They were being curated. Only the most visually disturbing were selected. Those with mouths agape, hands twisted, eyes intact, as though agony itself had become the museum's admission ticket. Guanajuato no longer waited for time to tell its story. Now, it was writing it in flesh. And as the science became harder to ignore, another truth began to emerge. One that no tourist pamphlet, no museum guide, and no official would ever admit. Some of the mummies may not just show what happens after death. They might be showing us what it looks like to witness it. By the time visitors reach the back chambers of the Guanajuato Mummy Museum, the laughter has usually stopped. What begins as a macabre curiosity, the novelty of seeing a real human mummy, becomes something colder, heavier, a suffocating silence that even the best-lit exhibits can't banish. Because by the final corridor, you're no longer seeing artifacts. You're seeing people, frozen mid-scream, mouths agape, eyes half open, some holding children, others buried alone. And for some visitors, that's when the whispers start. Not in their heads, in the room. Staff have long refused to speak on the record about what happens after hours. But off the record, a dozen former workers tell the same story. The museum doesn't sleep. Doors open by themselves. Security cameras glitch at the same time every night, just after 3 a.m. And most chillingly, there are whispers, always near the same group of mummies, always in Spanish. Words that no one alive can fully make out. A few brave employees placed recorders in the corridor overnight. The audio came back, corrupted, but on several tapes, faint sounds emerged. Breathing, footsteps, and on one, something unmistakable, a woman weeping. They say it comes from Ignacia Aguilar's display. She's never been moved, never been taken on tour, and she is the only mummy with documented evidence of being buried alive. Visitors report a strange vibration when they stand near her case. Some feel dizzy, others feel watched. A few have fainted. Local folklore has rebranded her, not as a victim, but as a guardian, the one who remembers everything. The stories grew louder in 2017 when a fire broke out in a nearby administrative office. No one was harmed, but files were destroyed, including original burial records. The incident was ruled accidental, electrical failure, but not everyone believes that. Some claim the fire was set to erase names, to silence stories. The museum, of course, denies all of it, but they can't deny what came next. In the spring of 2019, a team of researchers arrived unannounced. Anthropologists, forensic experts, accompanied by legal observers. Their aim? To re-examine a dozen specific mummies, ones with suspected signs of conscious burial. Their request was denied. No reason was given. Just a simple statement from the city council. These individuals belong to the cultural patrimony of Guanajuato. That word again, belong. Not to their families, not to God, not even to death, but to the museum, the city, the economy. And that's when the protests began. Small at first, local activists demanding that the remains be returned to their families, or at least reburied with dignity. They held vigils, lit candles outside the cemetery, read the names of the dead, one by one. And for a moment, the world listened. International media arrived. Documentaries were made. Even UNESCO raised questions about the ethics of human remains on display without consent. The city responded with promises. They'd review burial policies. They'd improve climate controls. They'd consider limiting exhumations. But months passed. The lights stayed on. The tickets still sold. And Ignacia kept screaming behind the glass. Because beneath it all, beneath the science, the scandals, the folklore, was a deeper truth. Guanajuato is haunted. Not by ghosts, but by consequences. By the silence of those who saw the signs and looked away. By a system that punished poverty even after death. By the generations that profited from agony and then put it on a shelf. And if you stand in the museum long enough, after the crowds are gone, after the lights dim, you might just hear them. Not screaming, not crying, whispering. Remember us. Guanajuato's mummies are more than relics. They are warnings. The crypt tax still exists. Today, it's rarely enforced with the same brutality as in the 19th century. Yet it still hangs like a shadow over the poor and forgotten. In recent decades, families facing financial hardship have found themselves caught between tradition and survival. When a loved one dies, funeral expenses can be crippling. If the tax isn't paid, the city retains the legal right to reclaim the body. In 2014, a young man named Carlos Hernandez died in a traffic accident. His family could not afford the funeral costs or the crypt fees. Months later, workers exhumed his remains and moved them to the charnel house, the same place where the mummies once piled up. Carlos's family wasn't informed. His grandmother discovered the truth only when visiting the cemetery, searching for his grave. Stories like Carlos's are not rare. They reveal a legacy that refuses to die. And it's not just about bodies. The curse of Guanajuato is the curse of forgetting. For centuries, poverty condemned people twice, once in life and again in death. The mummified dead are a haunting reminder of how systems punish those with no voice, no money, no protection. Yet, even now, the city clings to its twisted pride. Tourism is its lifeblood, the museum its crown jewel. Despite calls for ethical reform, the display remains open. Visitors still come from around the world. They marvel. They shudder. They snap photos. But what they don't see is the cost beneath the glass. The faces that stare back are silent witnesses to neglect, to injustice, and to a society that turned its dead into spectacle. And the city watches back. Guanajuato's mummies, still with their glassy eyes, still mid-scream, are not just history. They are a living warning. To remember the forgotten, or risk becoming one yourself. The question now is, will we listen? Will we honor the dead? Or will we bury the truth forever? If this story unsettled you, if the shadows it casts linger long after the screen fades to black, don't forget to subscribe. Share your thoughts below, and explore more tales where history's darkest corners come alive. Because some stories refuse to rest, and neither should we.